Coming to you from a cozy little condo high atop Old 4th Ward, Atlanta. Welcome to The Ron Show on America One Radio. Here's your host, Ron Roberts.
As we head into Mother's Day weekend, I thank you for listening. Whether it's on the America One Radio app, AmericaOneRadio.com, on demand at ProgressiveVoices.com, or wherever you podcast. President Joe Biden sat down with Aaron Burnett from CNN. Let me give you a little bit of this audio before we dive in.
Israel is striking Rafah. I know that you have paused, Mr. President, shipments of 2,000-pound U.S. bombs to Israel due to concern that they could be used in any offensive on Rafah. Have those bombs, those powerful 2,000-pound bombs, been used to kill civilians in Gaza?
Civilians have been killed in Gaza as a consequence of those bombs and other ways in which they go after population centers. And I made it clear that if they go into Rafah, they haven't gone into Rafah yet. If they go into Rafah, I'm not supplying the weapons that have been used historically to deal with Rafah, to deal with the cities, to deal with that problem. We're going to continue to make sure Israel is secure in terms of Iron Dome and their ability to respond to attacks like came out of the Middle East recently. But it's just wrong. We're not going to supply the weapons and the artillery shells used that have been used.
Artillery shells as well.
Yeah, artillery shells.
So, just to understand what they're doing right now in Rafah. Is that not going into Rafah as you defined it?
They haven't gone into the population centers. What they did is right on the border, and it's causing problems with right now in terms of with Egypt, which I've worked very hard to make sure we have a relationship and help. But I've made it clear to Bibi and the War Cabinet, they're not going to get our support if, in fact, they go in these population centers.
Naturally, from the Republicans, like Lindsey Graham, you have a predictable, hyperbolic overreaction.
And you're telling me you're going to tell them how to fight the war and what they can and can't use when everybody around them wants to kill all the Jews? And you're telling me that if we withhold weapons in this fight, the existential fight for the life of the Jewish state, it won't send the wrong signal? Do you still think it was a good idea, General Austin, to get out of Afghanistan?
That is Senator Lindsey Graham just kvetching, there's a Jewish term, at a hearing where the Senate committee was grilling Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin.
We will pay a price. This is obscene. It is absurd. Give Israel what they need to fight the war they can't afford to lose. This is Hiroshima and Nagasaki on steroids.
Lindsey Graham is obviously not a student of history. He's also just going way overboard with the hyperbole. I mention history because, first of all, there are U.S. and international laws that the President of the United States has to adhere to when it comes to aiding an ally militarily. Also, there's precedent. Ronald Reagan did this. He blocked an F-16 shipment back in the early 1980s when Reagan had had enough with Menachem Begin and Israel going overboard with its attack on Lebanon. This, according to the Responsible Statecraft, I'll share this in the show notes at ronshowatl.com. Lawrence Korb writing this. Dropping this, wow, this says May 24th of 2021, but this feels really current. President Biden has taken a lot of heat from lawmakers in his own party for not being tough enough on Israel for its violence in Gaza and in East Jerusalem this month. Interestingly, my old boss, President Ronald Reagan, could not be accused of the same and actually set a precedent for holding Tel Aviv to task without breaking the special bond between the United States and Israel. It can be done, Lawrence Korb writes. Korb continues down in the article. This was written, I think, after the October 7th attack. I'm sorry, this had to be like early in January. I'm having a hard time telling you exactly when this was written because the byline says May 24th of 2021, but this is obviously not the case. It is possible to know why Biden has taken these steps. He is in no doubt wary of the tremendous criticism he would get from most Republicans, some member of his own party, and the pro-Israel lobby, if he were to have done things any other way. He no doubt remembers the criticism that President Obama received from these three groups in 2016 when he failed to veto a UN resolution that demanded that Israel halt Jewish settlements in all Palestinian territories, including East Jerusalem, occupied since 1967. In fact, Obama was much more willing to veto UN resolutions condemning Israel violence than the Republican presidents who preceded him, including Reagan and the two Bushes. President Reagan, for whom Lawrence Korb says he had the honor of serving for 4.5 years, actually allowed 21 UN resolutions that directly or indirectly condemned Israeli behavior and actions to pass. These included condemning Israel for the bombing of Lebanon, Iraq, and Tunisia. President George H.W. Bush allowed 9 UN resolutions, including one that criticized Israel for deporting Palestinians that it perceived as anti-Israeli, to pass, while George W. Bush allowed 6 more, including one that called on Israel to stop demolishing the houses of Palestinian civilians. Obama allowed only 1 UN resolution against the expansion of the settlements to pass before leaving office in December of 2016. In addition to not vetoing UN resolutions, Reagan took several actions that many in Israel and the United States perceived as anti-Israel. Did you learn any of this in history class? Well, I mean, of course not. We weren't taught this sort of nuance. But this is something worth bringing up now. Lawrence Korb writes, for example, on June 7, 1981, less than 6 months after Reagan took office, Israel launched a surprise bombing raid on the Iraqi nuclear reactor at Osirak, and in doing so, violated the airspace of Saudi Arabia and Jordan. Reagan not only supported UNSC Resolution 487, which condemned the attack, but he also criticized the raid publicly and suspended the delivery of advanced F-16 fighter jets to Israel. Moreover, over the strident objections of Israel and the pro-Israel U.S. lobby groups, Reagan approved the sale of advanced reconnaissance aircraft to Saudi Arabia, which Israel then viewed as a hostile state. A year later, in August 1982, when Israeli forces advanced beyond southern Lebanon and began shelling the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, in Beirut, Reagan responded with an angry call to Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, demanding a halt to the operation. In addition, during the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, Reagan intervened directly when Israel threatened to blow up the Commodore Hotel in downtown Beirut, which housed more than 100 Western reporters. As David Ottaway, who was then the Washington Post Middle East correspondent and was in the building, pointed out, the Israel Defense Minister did not like the media coverage the invasion was getting and wanted to close down the media center. Biden, on the other hand, Lawrence Korb writes, even though he had an hour's notice, failed to intervene to stop Netanyahu from bombing and collapsing the 12-story building that housed the offices of Al Jazeera and the Associated Press in Gaza during the recent bombing campaign. He also failed to publicly condemn the attack, let alone challenge Israel's contention that the buildings sheltered Hamas military intelligence assets, despite AP's insistence that its staff had no evidence that such assets were or ever had been present. In addition, Lawrence Korb writes, to allowing the UN resolutions to pass and suspending the F-16 delivery, Ronald Reagan also restricted aid and military assistance to Israel to help force its withdrawal of troops from Beirut and central Lebanon. Therefore, if in the future some members of the Biden administration or Congress want to join the international community in condemning Israel's behavior or in conditioning U.S. assistance or arms transfer and face resistance from Republicans, they need only point to the precedents established by President Reagan in the first instance. This may actually provide President Biden an opportunity to, you can't really wash your hands of all that's already occurred, but you can at least say, try to be reasonable. Benjamin Netanyahu says Israel can stand alone after the president sent a warning shot about ending U.S. arms shipment. USA Today reporting Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said Thursday that Israel was strong enough to fight alone if needed after President Joe Biden warned that U.S. arms shipments to the country could be stopped if he ordered a full-scale invasion of Rafah and Gaza. He said, if we need to stand alone, we will stand alone. I've said that if necessary, we will fight with our fingernails. I mean, it's easy to say that because we've been shipping arms and financial aid to Israel. Israel is the largest international benefactor of U.S. aid and has been for decades. So it stands to reason that if Joe Biden wants to take political cover and say, all right, no more bombs to Israel if they're going to act indiscriminately in population centers. It gives Biden political cover. Netanyahu says, fine, we'll go it alone. And perhaps that is what happens. Or perhaps Biden's actions draw down the Israeli military operation. Back to the USA Today. In the message, Netanyahu invoked the 1948 war when Israel was attacked by a coalition of Arab countries after it declared its independence in the wake of a United Nations plan to partition the then British mandate into two states, one Jewish, one Arab. In the War of Independence 76 years ago, we were the few against the many, he said. We did not have weapons. There was an arms embargo on Israel, but with great strength of spirit, heroism, unity among us, we were victorious. It's kind of apples and oranges because, again, we've been supplying plenty to Israel for quite a while. His government, according to the USA Today, has vowed to enter Rafah to crush Hamas militants behind the October 7th border attacks that triggered the Israel-Hamas war. Israel's military says that it has dismantled at least 18 of Hamas' 24 battalions. However, it believes thousands of Hamas fighters are hiding in Rafah. Israel's operation in Rafah has so far appeared to be limited in scope. But world leaders fear an even larger humanitarian crisis there. And even without a full-scale Rafah invasion, medical facilities in Gaza's southernmost city have been overwhelmed. It was, by the way, about a week ago that there was a good bit of optimism for a ceasefire agreement. That, in the last 7 days, of course, has since stalled. I'm just kind of watching with interest here as Republicans rush to a press gaggle to talk about how Biden has somehow turned his back on Israel while they fail to seem to be aware of history about 42 years ago when a man that they revere as a conservative icon, President Ronald Reagan, used the same tactic to convince Israel to draw down its military operations. I'm more thoroughly convinced than ever that Ronald Reagan, if he existed in today's political climate, would be branded a rhino, obviously, at the very least. And it could be argued is an anti-First Amendment, anti-Israel liberal by today's conservative and GOP culture. I keep saying maybe we're going to see this fever break at some point in time, and maybe Marjorie Taylor Greene's antics earlier this week and GOP reaction afterwards indicates that we could see a turning point. It is fascinating to watch, though, the inner struggles of the GOP right now. Back after this. Visit ronshowatl.com to catch up on past episodes. You can also, by the way, drop a little donation there, kind of keep the show flowing here. You don't hear commercial breaks when you listen to this via podcast or on demand at progressivevoices.com. And the commercials you hear on America One Radio do not benefit this show in any way, shape, form, or fashion. I don't know, a little cup of coffee would be nice. Just kind of something to kind of help the show. And by the way, this is an expense for me, like the mixing board, the laptop, the Dropbox storage use. This stuff sort of adds up. The domain, this is all out of pocket right now. If you enjoy the show and you're like, you know what, let me just help this guy out. Please, thank you. I appreciate that. You can do that on the donate tab at ronshowatl.com. So as I watch the amoebic-like formation of whatever the GOP is aiming to be, is it the MAGA party? Is it the party of Donald Trump? Is the stoutness, the ability of House Speaker Mike Johnson to say to the Marjorie Taylor Greenes within the camp, no, we're not putting up with this any longer. Is that his strength? Is that the strength of the GOP moving forward? Or did he just seriously get bailed out by a handful of Democrats who said, listen, we got to govern, we got to get some stuff done, and we're going to help you out here? I tend to think it's more of that than an ascendancy of a Ben Sasse, Liz Cheney, more intellectual and or mainstream version of the Republican Party that we came to know prior to the ascendancy of Donald Trump. And I say that because, you got Jim Jordan in the House calling on the ability to grill Nathan Wade in a hearing. Why? What purpose does that serve other than political? And by the way, what happened? What happened to the Biden impeachment hearings? What happened to the Hunter Biden hearings? It's as if they hit a wall, they came up with nothing, and quietly they've got to look for something else. So let's investigate Fonnie Willis and Nathan Wade. Just looking for names, liberal boogeymen to pounce on, to squeeze some juice out of, to get a little rise out of the Fox News audience, right? To what end? And then Mike Johnson, who again, you would think may have an opportunity to help guide the GOP out of this Trumpism, this long losing streak that his party has been dealing with, instead does this.
One of the things that is also in jeopardy right now is our judicial branch, and it's our system of government itself. And I don't think we can say often enough here how much that has been abused under this administration, and with local prosecutors, state prosecutors, and at the federal level, who are using lawfare. They're using our judicial system to go after political opponents. The most obvious example of that, and I think the most egregious one in history, is what is being done to Donald Trump right now. This is yet another week where cable TV has a split screen image, right? On one side, turn on any news station, you see the partisan prosecutors and the double standard DOJ going after President Trump. And on the other side, college campuses being wrecked by anti-Semitic mobs. In Manhattan, in the New York case. It's play-by-play on all the stations, right? That case should never have been brought. If there's ever been an example of lawfare, everybody can look at that and see. The trial is being orchestrated by Democrat supporters of President Biden who are trying to make a name for themselves. They're pretty open about that. They used it in their campaign pledges. We've got a Democrat district attorney, a Biden donor judge, whose daughter is a Democratic political consultant and has clients that use the case in their solicitation emails to raise money. And now we've learned there's an assistant DA who was recently a top man at the DOJ and received over $10,000 in payments from the Democratic National Committee.
Speaker Johnson doesn't want to speak to all that we've learned about Clarence Thomas through ProPublica over the last year. He doesn't want to speak to Judge Eileen Cannon in Florida overseeing the Trump Mar-a-Lago documents case. He also doesn't want to speak to the guilty pleas here in the state of Georgia that lend credence to the existence of the Trump 2020 election interference case. The phone call between Georgia's Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger and President Donald Trump. It's the law and order party here, y'all. And the Speaker of the House, one of the leading Republican politicians in this country of the law and order party, doesn't want to speak to the crime or the alleged crimes and the alleged criminal. No, he wants to speak to the prosecution. He wants to talk about the weaponization of our judicial system for political purposes. When he fails to point out how stacked our judiciary is with Trump appointees who are aiding his ability to continue delaying long enough for him to potentially seek the office, win the office that he seeks, and self-pardon. You know what I'd love to hear Mike Johnson say? I'd love to hear Mike Johnson say,
this is all wrong. It doesn't matter what political party you're in. You have to look at this. If you look at this objectively, you know deep down that this is wrong.
Actually, he did say that. He just didn't say that about Trump's cover-ups and delay and obstruction while in office and afterwards. No, he's saying that actually this is the Speaker of the House, one of the leading GOP voices in office, member of the Law and Order Party, speaking against the very mechanisms that are in place to bring law and order and justice to those who violate the law and disrupt order. Just so you know, by the way, that is not an ancient clip. That is earlier this week, the same week that he is fending off an attack from Marjorie Taylor Greene to be removed from the speakership with the help of the Democrats that he is also attacking. Notice, by the way, he didn't say a word about the Hunter Biden investigation or the laptop or the Biden impeachment or the Mayorkas impeachment. No. He is shilling for the former president and the current GOP nominee for the presidency. And I point all this out because while there is a lot of backlash for Marjorie Taylor Greene's antics, and there was broad consensus within the GOP and Democrats in the House and Senate to get Ukraine aid, the GOP just can't quit its feelings for Donald John Trump and the voters he brings.
Broadcasting 5 days a week to make common sense common again. This is The Ron Show on America One Radio.
So I teased this yesterday, and I decided I wanted to dive into this a good bit today. Ann Applebaum is a writer with The Atlantic, and she released a piece here just days ago that speaks to the continual creep, the pushback, I guess you would say, from nations like Russia and China, who are pushing back against democracy. Now listen. Democracy is something that we wax poetic about here in the United States, except we don't actually embrace it. I mean, anyone with something of a grasp on civics knows that we are not a democracy. We are a representative republic. We hear that all the time, anytime the popular vote goes one way in the presidential cycle, but the Electoral College says, but wait just a minute. We got these little nuances, these little rules, the way things break down that prevent the will of the people actually taking shape. We saw that in 2000. Al Gore won the popular vote, did not win the presidency. We saw an even more egregious example of that, of course, in 2016, when Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by more than 3 million American votes, and yet, because of the Electoral College, did not win. Now, you could make an argument, and our forefathers really sat down and tried to figure out how to make this system work in such a way that we had elements of democracy and elements of representation, a representative republic. But the Electoral College has lost its rationale for being. Only because we as a country have allowed that to be. The Electoral College, in theory, would allow states to have weight based on its population to determine who becomes president of the United States without allowing the air quote mob rule to take effect and elect, just any nut who's popular. Although I think we're actually seeing the mob actually rule from one party, and we see what that yields us. It is my argument, by the way, that the will of the people to elect someone vastly more sane and vastly more qualified to the highest office in the country would have been a better service to the country. The Electoral College fails because we stopped growing our House of Representatives in the 1930s. It's sat at 435 for nearly 100 years. Our population has nearly tripled since then. You would think then that the House of Representatives should grow with it, right? It hasn't. We should have about 1,200 or more folks in the House of Representatives. And because we don't have that, it has stifled the growth of the Electoral College. Famously, you need 270 to win. And we're stuck at, 535 plus, you get your 2 U.S. senators, you get all the members of the House of Representatives. That's what reflects what each state will get. Their congressional representation, senators and House members, is what determines their electoral votes. California is 66 times as populous as Wyoming, the smallest state in the country. and yet only gets 18 times the representation in the Electoral College. So you see, the math ain't math in there. We're not a democracy. I pointed this out yesterday when Rachel Maddow showed you, by the way, that the Washington State GOP would like to just get rid of democracy altogether. Not hyperbolic. She says as much. Listen to this.
They decided that as the Washington State Republican Party, they would this year take a stand against democracy. And I do not mean this as a metaphor. I am not performing political analysis. I am literally describing what they literally did.
We do not want to be a democracy. Originally, congressmen were elected by a direct democracy, senators were elected by their state legislatures, and presidents are elected by the Electoral College. We are devolving into a democracy because now congressmen and senators are elected by the same pool, a direct democracy. And with the national popular vote coming, we're going to be electing our president by a direct democracy too. Bad idea.
Devolving?
Bad idea. We are devolving into a democracy. We do not want to be a democracy. Okay. As Danny Westneat at the Seattle Times reported, delegates of the Washington State Republican Convention then stood up one by one to argue that the U.S. should repeal the 17th Amendment, which allows us to vote for our United States senators. After that resolution passed, they went bigger. They voted to put this language into their platform. Quote, we encourage Republicans to substitute the words republic and republicanism where previously they have used the word democracy. Every time the word democracy is used favorably, it serves to promote the principles of the Democratic Party, the principles of which we ardently oppose. Quote, we oppose legislation which makes our nation more democratic in nature.
Eeks.
We oppose legislation which makes our nation more democratic in nature. So say Washington State Republicans, officially in writing in their party platform. What's going on here?
Well, again, I point back to the piece that Ann Applebaum wrote in The Atlantic, and there's some notes about that in the Atlantic cover story that they published on May 6th, which isn't behind a paywall. Her article actually is, unfortunately. For The Atlantic's June cover story, Democracy is Losing the Propaganda War, staff writer Ann Applebaum reports on how autocrats in China, Russia, and other places around the world are now making common cause with MAGA Republicans to discredit liberalism and freedom everywhere. Applebaum's story is adapted from her forthcoming book, Autocracy, Inc., publishing July 23rd, and draws from her exceptional reporting for The Atlantic writes. Even in authoritarian states where surveillance is almost total, Applebaum reports the experience of tyranny and injustice can radicalize people. Anger at arbitrary power will always lead someone to start thinking about another system, a better way to run society. This has resulted in autocratic regimes slowly turning their repressive mechanisms outward into the democratic world. Applebaum writes, if people are naturally drawn to the image of human rights, to the language of democracy, to the dream of freedom, then those concepts have to be poisoned. That requires more than surveillance, more than close observation of the population, more than a political system that defends against liberal ideas. It also requires an offensive plan, a narrative that damages both the idea of democracy everywhere in the world and the tools to deliver it. To accomplish this, Applebaum reports autocracies are now making systematic efforts to influence both popular and elite audiences, including via the use of state-controlled media, most notably China's Xinhua news agency and Russia's RT, but also Venezuela's Telesur network and Iran's Press TV, along with numerous others to create stories, slogans, memes, and narratives promoting the worldview of the autocracies. These, in turn, are repeated and amplified in other countries, translated into multiple languages, and reshaped for local markets around the world. When these stories make their way to the U.S., Applebaum reports, quote, a part of the American political spectrum is not merely a passive recipient of the combined authoritarian narratives that come from Russia, China, and their ilk, but an active participant in creating and spreading them. Like the leaders of those countries, the American MAGA right also wants Americans to believe that their democracy is degenerate, their elections illegitimate, their civilization dying. Sound familiar? The MAGA movement's leaders also have an interest in pumping nihilism and cynicism into the brains of their fellow citizens. and in convincing them that nothing they see is true. Their goals are so similar that it is hard to distinguish between the online American alt-right and its foreign amplifiers. We just heard Speaker of the House Mike Johnson talk about the illegitimacy of the Justice Department trying to seek justice against the multiply indicted former president, who just so happens to be a Republican, House Speaker of the same party. Because none of what you're hearing he allegedly said or did, even when he admits so on a hot mic for Access Hollywood, is actually something he should be prosecuted for if there are those who credibly say, well, he actually didn't just say that, he actually did that. The phone call that we heard many times between the former president and Georgia's Secretary of State should have no, ignore that. That's just because you heard that doesn't mean he actually did that. Or the multiple guilty pleas from some of his co-conspirators. Ignore that. Ignore the man behind the curtain. Applebaum continues, the State Department has in the past decade created a division to preemptively combat, or pre-bunk, she says, foreign disinformation operations. But no such agency exists to combat the spread of Russian and Chinese propaganda within the United States. One could call this a secret authoritarian plot to preserve the ability to spread anti-democratic conspiracy theories, except that it's not a secret. It's all visible right on the surface, Applebaum writes. Russia, China, and sometimes other state actors, Venezuela, Iran, Hungary, work with Americans to discredit democracy, to undermine the credibility of democratic leaders, to mock the rule of law. They do so with the goal of electing Trump, whose second presidency would damage the image of democracy around the world, as well as the stability of democracy in America even further. When I say politicians like Marjorie Taylor Greene are tools of Vladimir Putin, I'm not being hyperbolic. And Applebaum was on Amanpour and Company a few weeks back, I believe, and Walter Isaacson queried her on the GOP's pro-Russia caucus, for example.
You know, a lot of people refer to the GOP holdouts, the people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, as ultra-conservatives. I've never quite understood that designation. I think in your piece, you call them the pro-Russian part of the Republican Party, or pro-Kremlin, pro-Moscow. Why do you think that's a better description?
So conservative implies that you're conserving something, that you're, in the United States, it implies that you're conserving some kind of American tradition. I don't see that advocating on behalf of a foreign dictatorship is conservative. It seems radical to me, or extremist. Or as I wrote, you can just call it pro-Russian, which is what it is. Marjorie Taylor Greene comes to Congress and produces photographs and material that come directly from Russian propaganda sites. And she, describing the Ukrainians as Nazis and so on. She actually uses the language of Russian propaganda, in Congress, in public. And that doesn't seem very conservative to me. It seems extremist and pro-Russian. And so you're absolutely right to point to this misuse of language, this misuse of the word conservative to describe her and the others in that group who are now radically pro-Russian.
Let me read you a quote from your piece. You say, anyone who seeks to manipulate the foreign policy of the United States, whether it be the tin pot autocrat in Hungary or the Communist Party of China, now knows that a carefully designed propaganda campaign, when targeted at the right people, can succeed. You're an expert in information, misinformation, and propaganda targeting. What do you mean by that? Do you think that the pro-Russian Republicans were manipulated by propaganda campaigns?
Yes.
It is certainly the case that Russian propaganda was used by members of the U.S. Congress in their public debates and even in private conversations. The Republican Senator Tom Tillis has described how he heard his colleagues in debate about Ukraine using a story that we know is fake. This is a story that President Zelensky owns 2 yachts. Okay, there was a photograph of the yachts circulating on the internet, and the yachts actually belonged to other people, and so on. It was a easily disproved fake. And yet, there were Republican senators saying, we shouldn't give this aid money to Ukraine because it will just be used to buy some more yachts. This is really extraordinary. This means that there's a direct path from an invented story to the U.S. Congress, probably via some kind of internet echo chamber in which Russian and far right propaganda mix. But it is now possible to get those ideas into the heads of U.S. Congress. People, they aren't resistant to it in a way they might once have been. And this by itself was an incredible success. The Russians at least managed to delay the aid package for a year by targeting these kinds of lies, by creating a campaign around the hopelessness of the war, around the pointlessness of supporting Ukraine. And of course, there still are both senators and congressmen using that language. But they did it successfully. And it has to be the case that others will look at it and say, oh, it's that easy. If you can get Congress to go along with your made up stories, then it's certainly worth trying. I mean, sometimes the Russian efforts to manipulate conversations, whether it's in the U.S. or anywhere else, can be a little nutty. I mean, it's almost like they throw spaghetti at the wall and they just see what sticks. But this was a really carefully targeted, careful campaign. And as I said, make it look hopeless. Ukraine can't win. Ukrainians are corrupt. Ukraine isn't democratic. The Ukrainians are Nazis, and all of that was eventually used by actual members of Congress in their public statements. So we know that it got through to them.
I mean, listen, it's no secret. We know that Vladimir Putin used our own social media to poison our electorate, mentally anyway, before the 2016 election. And it had an impact. And now we know, we can see this literally playing out, as Ann Applebaum opined there, that we have people in Congress who are just as susceptible to being duped by misinformation from foreign adversaries as well. And back to the way we elect our presidents and this push, again, in Washington state for Republicans to roll back the way we elect senators as well, to move away from democracy. It gives our push to spread democracy throughout the world. Remember, that was the George W. Bush doctrine. That's what he wanted to do in Iraq and Afghanistan, right? He wanted to spread democracy across the globe. It means we lack credibility in even trying to do so when we can't accept democracy here ourselves, when we cling to ancient and obviously flawed systems to elect our own leadership so that the will of the minority maintains control over the will of the majority. We're a slightly more liberal country than we are conservative, and yet we have a 6-3 imbalance on the Supreme Court. We've had 2 presidential elections, 12 years of governance out of the last 24 that went against the will of the people. I mean, good luck explaining that to the global community you're trying to convince democracy is a good thing to, when we barely understand it here in the United States ourselves. I mean, that's the long and the short of it. And I think that feeds into the frustration that Americans have with our government, period. The will of the majority never sees the light of day, or doesn't see the light of day nearly enough. The progress they expect to see, they don't see, despite showing up to vote for it all the time. Just something to think about. More after this. The Ron Show on the America One Radio app, AmericaOneRadio.com, wherever you podcast. As we head into the home stretch, I just have about 5 or 6 minutes here. And I had something, you know how you keep tabs open on I had something about the number of Democratic voters in the state of Georgia, that the state has about 13,500 more new Democratic voters versus new Republican voters. I don't know. Let's dive into that some other day. We're heading into the Mother's Day weekend, and it's been 12 years since I've had the opportunity, actually 13, since I've had the opportunity to celebrate a Mother's Day with my mom. My mom passed away back in 2011 to gallbladder cancer. Gallbladder cancer is one of those cancers you don't know you got until it's too late really to deal with it, unfortunately. And I honestly have not kept up with the advancements for cancer detection in that realm to know any better than that. That's just something that I've come to know. So I have to be honest. When I worked in radio broadcasting, I started out while in high school, actually. I had a weekend overnight job at a station in Martinez, Georgia, outside Augusta. My aunt and my uncle used to stay up late and call in and make requests. And, obviously I played it for them, except when it was in Agata de Vida. Come on. I can't cough up that much time on my shift. Mom didn't get to listen that much because it's weekend overnights, for crying out loud, and she went to bed at a reasonable hour. But when I came back to Augusta and hosted Morning Drive, she was a loyal, religious listener. I mean, every day. In fact, so much so that, there was a few days where I was just completely bummed out, depressed about a breakup, and I didn't go to work for 3 straight days, and Mom's listening. She's only 15 miles outside Augusta. She sent Dad to check on me. When I left Augusta and followed my career to Mobile, Alabama, and then to Central Louisiana, where I managed my first station and was the morning show host, she was always pushing us. When are you guys going to go on the internet? When can I listen to you live? There are stations doing this now. Why aren't you doing this? We were a small company, big station, small company, and the bosses were dragging about that. Well, eventually, we got to where we were streaming, and I was so excited, and I told my mom about it so that she could listen. Loved my co-hosts. We had a great show. Really did have a great show for such a small market and a little radio station, a big radio station, small market. Anyway, I tell people all the time that I remember how Mom sounds. I remember her voice. I remember how she smells. I remember how a hug feels from her. And I'm always grateful that I have somewhere in the depths of, I think it's a SoundCloud account of mine. It is. It's a SoundCloud account. That I have a clip of Mom and I communicating. And this was me excitedly calling her to see if she was, listening via stream, because I told her how to do it. It was complicated back then, I readily admit. And here's how this conversation went.
Hello?
Hey, Mom.
Hey.
Hey, you guys, logged on by chance?
Not yet.
Oh, well, we're on the air.
Well, I'm sorry.
Oh, don't get after her. Yeah, don't get after her. Come on now.
Call me back next Friday, okay?
I gotta give you a whole week?
Yeah.
Oh, man. Call me back next Friday. What I wouldn't give to be able to call her back next Friday. I guess I just wanted to share that so that there's a little continuation of Mom's existence in the world, on the internet, and it was just good to hear her voice. I'm getting goosebumps and my eyes are welling up just thinking about that. Good times. She was on me all the time to come home when possible, when the job allowed, when the schedule allowed, when there was money to do so. And I can't tell you how many times she, and sometimes with my aunt, would drive all the way up from Augusta to pick me up at the airport in Atlanta, to excitedly bring me to Augusta, even for just a weekend like Father's Day weekend, or for Thanksgiving, or for Christmas, or obviously for birthdays, and obviously for Mother's Day. Eventually, my career took me to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina in 2007. And so the last 3.5-4 years of her life, I was just 4 hours away. A little 3.5-4 hour drive. That was perfect. Obviously, because it was Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, which meant that I lived somewhere where the family could come and hang and, oh, by the way, go to the beach and vacation, right? Pretty inexpensively. And those are great times. I really hate that, about 1.5 years of that was stunted because of her cancer diagnosis, but it was still just a lot of fun to be an adult and to be able to have a home and to know that they had a place to stay, and I got to spend a lot of quality time with my family and my mother in the last few years of her life. Whatever you're doing this weekend, hopefully it's spending time with your mom, or if you physically can't see her but can pick up the phone and call her, by all means do so, because the more you talk to her, the more her voice stays with you in the days and weeks and months and years afterwards when you won't have the ability to do so. Happy Mother's Day to all the moms out there. That's going to do it for The Ron Show. Back Monday, 9 to 10 a.m. on the American One Radio app, AmericanOneRadio.com, on demand at ProgressiveVoices.com, and wherever you podcast. Show notes at RonShowATL.com. Have a great weekend.